What if I told you that the fairy tales you grew up with, the sweet bedtime stories filled with princesses, glass slippers, and happily ever afters, were never meant to be comforting? What if I told you they were born from murder, starvation, rape, and mass child disappearances, that behind every magical castle was a corpse, and behind every once upon a time was a documented act of human cruelty? You've been reading horror stories your whole life, you just didn't know it yet. We're about to take a journey into the real origins of the world's most beloved fairy tale stories that were never designed to entertain children, but to warn adults, protect communities, and record the darkest chapters of European history. The Brothers Grimm weren't inventing stories, they were documenting trauma. And Disney didn't clean them up, they buried the bodies under glitter and musical numbers. From cannibalistic stepmothers to serial killers in disguise, these so-called fairy tales hold terrifying historical truths that were once whispered around dying campfires and carved into church walls. If you think you know Little Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, or Sleeping Beauty, think again. This isn't a bedtime story. This is a survival guide from the past, and it starts now. When you think of Little Red Riding Hood, you probably picture a sweet girl, a clever wolf, and a heroic woodsman. But the original story wasn't a charming lesson about listening to your mother, it was a survival warning wrapped in blood. In the 18th century, young girls in rural France were being stalked, mutilated, and devoured by a real-life predator, the Beast of Gévaudan, a creature so brutal it decapitated victims and sparked panic across Europe. The fairy tale wasn't fiction. It was a coded message passed from mother to daughter: don't walk alone. Don't talk to strangers. Predators wear human faces. That's the disturbing truth behind most fairy tales. They were born out of trauma, not imagination. The Pied Piper wasn't about pest control. It was a collective memory of 130 children vanishing overnight in medieval Germany. Hansel and Gretel wasn't a whimsical tale of breadcrumbs, it was inspired by starving parents abandoning their children during the Great Famine. These stories were blunt, brutal, and unapologetically real. But over centuries they were sanitized, stripped of their warning signs, and moral urgency, repackaged by Disney and polite society into soft, sing-song lullabies. And in doing so, we forgot what they were really trying to tell us. On the surface, the Pied Piper of Hamelin sounds like a harmless tale. A magical piper plays a flute to rid a town of its rats. But when the townspeople refuse to pay him, he takes revenge by luring their children away. It's often told with colorful illustrations and catchy rhymes, but beneath this whimsical surface lies one of the most chilling and well-documented child disappearances in medieval Europe. Because the story is not fiction, it's a historical trauma wrapped in metaphor. The records are real. In the German town of Hamelin, a date is carved into the stained glass of the town church, June 26, 1284, the day 130 children vanished without a trace. No mention of rats, no magic flute. Just a sudden collective loss so devastating that it burned itself into local memory court records and chronicles for centuries. What could possibly have happened? There are no definitive answers, only disturbing theories. One suggests that the children were victims of mass migration forcibly sent east to populate German settlements in newly conquered Slavic lands. This was common practice at the time, entire groups of children taken to colonize unfamiliar and often hostile territories, never to return. Another theory claims the children were led to their deaths in a nearby river, possibly victims of a mass drowning, an accident during a religious procession, or even a pagan ritual gone horribly wrong. Yet another posits that they were lured away by a cult-like leader promising salvation. No matter the version, the conclusion is the same: they never came back. The precision of the date is what truly unnerves historians. Medieval Europe rarely recorded exact days unless the event was catastrophic. The fact that June 26, 1284 was memorialized for centuries suggests an incident so unprecedented, so horrifying, that it shattered the town's sense of safety. The aftermath confirms it. Economic records show Hamelin suffered population collapse. Marriage registries reveal families fled. And to this day, one street in Hamelin remains music-free by local legend, because that's the path the children took as they disappeared. So where did the rats come from? That detail was added centuries later, likely to soften the blow for younger listeners. But the original story had no rats, no vermin, only children, missing, mourned, and never found. The colorful piper in reality was probably a metaphor for death, war, disease, or betrayal. The Pied Piper isn't a bedtime story. It's a centuries-old scar, a way for a community to process the unthinkable. And yet over time we turned that trauma into a fairy tale, smiling as we read it to our kids, never realizing it was based on a mass disappearance, so haunting it became part of Europe's darkest folklore. Forget the red cloak, the wicker basket, and the kindly grandmother tucked safely in bed. Little Red Riding Hood began as a blood-spattered news report, not a sweet bedtime rhyme. Its roots lie in south-central France, where from 1764 to 1767, an unknown predator known as La Bête du Gévaudan, the Beast of Gévaudan, stalked the rugged hills of Lozère and Haute-Loire. Contemporary parish registers, military dispatches, and even articles in La Gazette de France record the same nightmare pattern. More than 100 victims, many of them girls between 8 and 16, torn apart while traveling forest paths. Witnesses described a wolf-like creature the size of a young cow with reddish fur and enormous jaw, and a terrifying habit of standing upright like a man before it pounced. Villagers swore it studied its prey the way a sentient killer might, waiting until a shepherdess lagged behind, or a child walked alone carrying bread or cheese to a relative. Sound familiar? The similarities to the fairy tale are uncanny. The beast targeted lone girls with baskets, usually en route to sick grandparents or parents working distant fields. It chose isolation, shadowed them for miles, and then struck the throat or head for an instant, kill precisely where the fictional wolf lunges. Survivors told of claws raking bonnets from heads, jaws powerful enough to decapitate in a single bite. These testimonies ignited a national panic so great that Louis XV dispatched royal dragoons, offering a king's ransom for the creature's pelt. Newspapers printed woodcuts of a snarling, almost human wolf. Churches rang bells to warn parishioners before dusk. Parents prohibited children from venturing out, and if they had to, they armed them with spears or crude knives, primitive equivalents of the woodcutter's axe in later retellings. Yet the beast was more than a zoological mystery. It embodied every rural terror of the day, roaming bandits, feral wolves, and even rumored soldiers' mastiffs left behind after the 7 Years' War. One priest wrote that the creature was guided by Satan, echoing the way the brothers Grimm later personified the threat as a talking wolf in human clothing. Charles Perrault's 1697 literary version predates the Gévaudan attacks, but draws from earlier French folktales warning young women never to speak with loups-garous werewolves or metaphorically predatory men. After Gévaudan, local storytellers fused Perrault's cautionary fable with fresh horror, reinforcing an old rule with new blood: stay on the road, trust no stranger, and never travel the woods alone. When the creature was finally killed, accounts differ on whether it was a giant wolf, a wolf-dog hybrid, or several animals. The damage was done. Over 100 funerals, scores of mutilated bodies, and a generation traumatized. The story metastasized across Europe. By the time it reached Victorian nurseries and much later Disney storybooks, the true crime core had been scrubbed clean. The grandmother's flesh and blood screams became comedic snoring. The wolf's dismemberment became a cartoonish bellyache. And the lesson about predatory violence against girls was reduced to a polite reminder to mind your manners. But peel back the layers of Sugar and Ink and Little Red Riding Hood is not a quaint folk tale, it is a survival memo from 18th century France, written in tooth marks and sealed with royal wax. In the picture book version of Hansel and Gretel, two plucky children leave a trail of breadcrumbs, outwit a witch in a gingerbread cottage, and skip home to an apologetic father. But the real history behind the tale is far darker, an economic horror story carved into the annals of medieval Europe between 1315 and 1322, the years of the Great Famine. Relentless rain drowned crops, livestock perished from disease, and grain prices skyrocketed nearly 800% in modern market terms. Families who had lived month to month now faced a brutal arithmetic feed. Everyone and watched them all starve slowly or abandon the youngest, so the older labor-capable members might survive the winter. Court rolls, manorial ledgers, and grim sermons document hundreds of parents who walked their children deep into royal forests, far enough that tiny legs couldn't retrace the path and left them with a crust of rye, or if luck held a pouch of dried beans. Excavations in Germany's Spessart and Black Forest regions have uncovered shallow graves of juveniles dated by carbon analysis to exactly this famine window, confirming that what the brothers Grimm recorded 5 centuries later was rooted in physical evidence, not nightmare alone. Yet starvation was only half the threat. With law enforcement stretched thin and clerics overwhelmed by plague-level mortality, the woods became a refuge for outcasts who crossed the final moral boundary: cannibalism. Contemporary trial records from Hesse and Thuringia describe witch houses, isolated shacks, where desperate adults lured wandering children with the promise of bread, only to slaughter and eat them. Some were executed, others vanished as silently as their victims. In that context, the gingerbread cottage wasn't a whimsical confection, it was bait, the medieval equivalent of a white van and free candy. The witch herself symbolized a predator who weaponized food at a moment when hunger could override caution. And the oven, many indictments mention iron cauldrons large enough to boil a small body, or baking kilns repurposed for flesh. Oral tradition converted these grisly details into an oversized bread oven for mass-market retellings. The breadcrumbs, too, have historical grounding. Ethnographers note that parents sometimes taught older children to mark trees or lay pebbles, so smaller siblings could find the path home during wood-gathering chores. In desperate times, that same skill became a survival gambit for abandoned youngsters. Even the stepmother stereotype has roots in property law. Widowers who remarried during famine years often favored new wives over existing offspring when dividing a shrinking loaf. A dynamic, grim storytellers simplified into cruel stepmother orders the children's disposal. When the Grimms published Hansel and Gretel in 1812, Germany was still processing food shortages from the Napoleonic blockade. Their tale tapped into generational trauma so effectively that later editors softened it, adding Jules a happy reunion and a father racked by guilt so readers wouldn't taste the original ashes. Strip away those edits, and what remains is a survival manual etched in folklore. Beware strangers offering food. Learn to navigate dense woods and remember that in times of societal collapse, the real monsters aren't magical. They're hungry, desperate neighbors willing to turn children into supper. Forget singing animals and a prince's kiss. The real Snow White story begins in 16th century Germany with a teenage noblewoman named Margaretha von Waldeck and ends with a slow, deliberate poisoning that left her corpse looking eerily asleep. Born in 1533 to Philip IV, Count of a lucrative mining district in the Harz Mountains, Margaretha grew up surrounded by the brutal reality behind the 7 dwarfs. The Waldeck mines used child laborers' boys as young as 8, who were permanently stunted by malnutrition, arsenic dust, and days spent crawling through 18-inch-high tunnels. Locals called them Die Zwerglein little people. They weren't whimsical miners whistling while they worked. They were expendable kids whose bent spines and sunken faces testified to industrial greed. By 16, Margareta was renowned for her beauty, catching the eye of Spain's future King Philip II. That budding alliance threatened two powerful figures. Her stepmother, Katharina von Hatzfeld, who coveted the Waldeck fortune for her own children, and Spanish courtiers, alarmed that a German teenager might influence the future Habsburg monarch. Not long after marriage negotiations began, Margareta's health collapsed. Letters from her brother report sudden weakness, violent stomach cramps, and hair falling out in clumps, classic symptoms of chronic heavy metal poisoning, common and hard to trace in the 1500s. Within weeks, she was dead at age 17. Enter the magic mirror. Katharina was notoriously vain, owning imported Venetian mirrors that cost more than a peasant's annual wages. Household accounts show repeated purchases of cosmetics and mercury-based skin creams, luxury items, and convenient vectors for poison. Court rumors claimed she asked those mirrors daily who was fairest, dreading the answer her stepdaughter's rising status implied. After Margareta's death, Katharina secured control of Waldeck revenues, while Philip reluctantly abandoned any German marriage. Greed and vanity had prevailed, no dwarfs or witches required. The glass coffin detail in later retellings isn't fantasy either. Noble custom demanded that high-born women lie in state for days so mourners could pay respects. Certain poison cocktails, arsenic with antimony retard, visible decay leaving the skin waxy and pale. Witnesses wrote that Margareta looked untouched by death, a sleeping doll in a crystal casket. Villagers whispered it was holy, maybe miraculous. Storytellers turned the morbid display into a princess preserved by magic awaiting rescue. Fast forward to 1812. The brothers Grimm, combing German countryside lore, arrive in Waldeck. They hear about a beautiful maiden, an evil stepmother, and child miners, still called dwarfs. They sanitize the politics, swap arsenic for a poison apple, and add a necrophilic kiss to soften the ending for 19th century audiences. Disney would later rinse it further. The dwarfs gain names and personalities. The stepmother morphs into a cackling sorceress, and the socio-economic horror of child labor disappears under a technicolor rainbow. Strip away those pastel layers, and Snow White is no fairy tale. It's a true crime dossier about corporate greed, toxic beauty standards, and inheritance murder, a reminder that the monsters threatening young women are rarely mythical. Sometimes they're standing behind them at the vanity, asking the mirror the wrong question. Sleeping Beauty may look like an innocent fantasy about a princess kissed awake, but its earliest written form, Giambattista Basile's Sun Moon and Talia 1634, reads more like a court record deposition than a romance. In Basile's tale, the girl pricks her finger, falls into an irreversible sleep, and is discovered by a traveling king who does not kiss her. He rapes her unconscious body, then rides home to his real wife. Talia remains comatose throughout pregnancy and even childbirth. She awakens only when her infant twins, searching for milk, suck the splinter from her finger. Basile wasn't inventing shock value. He was mirroring a chilling medical and legal reality of Renaissance Europe noblewomen who slipped into catatonic states caused by epilepsy, ergot poisoning, postpartum depression, or what physicians called hysterical sleep, were often kept alive in guarded rooms, technically breathing, yet stripped of agency. Hospital registers from Paris to Naples describe sleeping maidens maintained for months, even years, in the hope they would recover. But those same ledgers also contain scandalous margins, caretakers fined for indecent handling, and confessions from priests, servants, and visiting nobles who exploited women immobilized by illness. One French case recorded in 1551 recounts Lady Isabeau de Solier, whose prolonged catatonia ended only after she delivered a stillborn child. An inquest revealed a family retainer had abused her nightly, rationalizing that no sin could occur without consciousness. Similar logic saturates Basile's text. The king acts without consent, then calmly returns home, his crime excused by the woman's silence. When Charles Perrault rewrote the story in 1697, he replaced rape with a pure kiss, scrapped the twins, and let true love erase moral ambiguity, yet kept the subtext that a powerless woman's body could be claimed by a powerful man. Even the brothers Grimm, publishing in 1812, retained this unequal dynamic. The princess sleeps eternally until a stranger asserts ownership through a single touch. The darker layer extends beyond sexual assault. Medieval medical guides warned families that deep sleepers risked being buried alive, hence the custom of 3-day vigils beside apparently dead maidens. Folklore scholars believe the spinning wheel curse may encode real instances of ergot-induced convulsions. Rye fungus wreaked havoc in damp harvest years, triggering seizures followed by profound stupor. Villagers baffled by bodies that felt warm yet unresponsive labeled them enchanted. In that vacuum of understanding, assault pregnancy and even infanticide could and did occur later, rationalized as acts of destiny. Modern retellings replace all this with pastel castles and a chaste rescue, but the skeleton remains Sleeping Beauty. Originated as a warning about how society treats unconscious women, first medical objects, then sexual prey, finally moral scapegoats. The happy ending is a retrofit to soothe readers who can't face the historical truth in a world where legal systems favored male guardianship and female virtue was defined by silence. Real Sleeping Beauties didn't wake to wedding bells. They woke, if they woke at all, into trauma scandal and lifelong blame for violations committed, while they literally could not speak. Before Bluebeard became a cautionary fable about female curiosity, he was flesh and blood. Gilles de Rais, a 15th-century French baron, celebrated war hero and one-time companion of Joan of Arc. To his neighbors in Brittany, Gilles was the picture of aristocratic splendor. Lavish banquets, private chaplains, traveling theatricals. But behind the crenellated walls of his chateau unfolded one of medieval Europe's most horrifying crime sprees: the systematic abduction, torture, and murder of an estimated 140 children between 1432 and 1440. Poor villagers, eager for work or eager to please a nobleman, sent their sons and daughters to his castle kitchens. None returned. When desperate parents begged for news, they were told the children had run away or been placed in other households. Excuses eerily similar to Bluebeard's previous wives are visiting relatives. The facade cracked only when a disgruntled accomplice tried to rob a church, and under torture revealed rooms caked in dried blood vats of quicklime used to dissolve bodies, and furnace ash still flecked with bone. Court transcripts preserved in Nantes detail how Gilles lured children with promises of silk and sweetmeats, locked them in a hidden chamber, then committed acts too graphic for the clerks to write in full. Those clerks accustomed to battlefield brutality described the evidence as mots si énormes, que la plume tremble, evils so enormous, the quill trembles. The parallels to the later fairy tale are unmistakable. Gilles owned multiple castles and forbade servants from entering certain towers, his real-life locked room. He hosted successive wives who died mysteriously, at least 2, after discovering incriminating traces in forbidden quarters. Neighbors whispered that blue dye from his heirloom armor stained his beard, giving rise to the moniker Barbe Bleue long before Perrault. And like Bluebeard, Gilles projected an irresistible charm, polished manners, impressive war credentials, and bottomless generosity, perfect camouflage for a serial killer who preyed on society's most vulnerable. Charles Perrault adapted the story in 1697, 2 centuries later, during Louis XIV's reign, when arranged marriages were transactional and young brides needed a primer on self-preservation. Perrault softened nothing about the room of corpses. He simply switched the victims from children to wives, making the lesson more direct. A husband's wealth cannot guarantee his goodness, and curiosity might be the only thing that saves you. Victorian editors, uncomfortable with spousal murder, shifted the moral focus to female disobedience. Disney would ultimately abandon Bluebeard entirely. He was too monstrous to merchandise. Yet the medieval court records remain, and they tell a story grimmer than any fairy tale. Gilles de Rais used his rank to buy silence. Local officials ignored missing child reports for years because nobles were considered above suspicion. Only when his debt spiraled and he began kidnapping from church properties did authorities act. The trial ended in execution, but not before a crowd of bereaved parents gathered outside the gallows, clutching faded tokens, ribbons, wooden toys once carried by children, invited to serve the lord of the chateau. So when you hear Bluebeard recited as a parable about wives minding keys, remember the archival truth. It was never about disobedient women. It was a community's desperate attempt to encode a warning: monsters wear fine clothes. Locked doors hide worse things than secrets. And power unchecked can turn castles into slaughterhouses. Strip away the Disney glitter, and each fairy tale reads like a medieval field guide to staying alive. Little Red Riding Hood drills the rule every parent preached in wolf-infested France. Never travel forest paths alone. Never speak to strangers who ask where you're going, and keep your eyes on the road. Hansel and Gretel teaches famine logic. Always mark your trail ration at your bread, and remember that a warm house in the woods might be bait, not refuge. Snow White warns daughters of powerful minds that beauty invites envy. Taste nothing a jealous relative prepares, and trust the little people who see abuse up close: child workers, servants, peasants. Even Sleeping Beauty in its raw form is a lesson about safeguarding unconscious women. Lock sick rooms, post trusted guards, and understand that comas don't protect virtue. For parents who lacked police, social services, or reliable courts, encoding hard truths into memorable stories was the only way to armor their children. The tales had to be vivid enough, frightening enough, that kids would recall them when no adult was there to help. In other words, these weren't bedtime fantasies. They were portable survival manuals stitched together with fear so the lessons could outlive the storytellers. The scariest part of these tales isn't the enchanted forest or the razor-toothed wolf. It's the reminder that humans create the real horror. A stepmother poisons her teenage rival to secure an inheritance. A baron cloaks child murder in velvet and Latin mass. Desperate parents abandon kids to famine, and soldiers in fine uniforms exploit unconscious women. The lesson is timeless, and practical monsters wear faces we recognize: family, neighbors, leaders, even heroes. That means vigilance can't stop at locking the door or teaching children stranger danger. It requires questioning power, spotting grooming tactics, and trusting your gut when charm masks control. It means believing survivors even when the accused is wealthy, popular, or could never. It urges communities to track the missing, audit the powerful, and refuse to excuse cruelty as tradition. For modern Americans raised on the idea that evil looks foreign or supernatural, these stories flip the script. The predator is often the respected insider, and safety is an active practice, not a handed-down promise. So next time a tale ends with happily ever after, remember the buried headline beneath it: Evil is ordinary, vigilance is essential, and real heroes are the ones who name the danger before it's too late. If this story changed the way you see your favorite childhood fairy tales, don't let it stop here. Leave a comment with the tale that shocked you the most, or share a dark origin story we haven't covered yet. Save this video so you can revisit these hidden truths. And if you want more disturbing history, hiding in plain sight, hit that subscribe button and join a community that digs deeper than Disney ever dared. History isn't just what's written in textbooks, it's what they don't want you to remember.